In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, and Boston felt it like a sudden hand reaching into daily life. This was not a distant trade rule on ships at sea. It demanded an official stamp, paid for in cash, on paper people used all the time: contracts, licenses, newspapers, even cards. For many colonists, it crossed a line. It looked like direct taxation by a government they did not elect. At first, the anger sounded familiar. Complaints in taverns, sharp lines in pamphlets, petitions aimed across the Atlantic. But the Stamp Act changed the math. If stamped paper became normal, Parliament proved it could tax the colonies whenever it wanted. In Boston, resistance stopped being private grumbling and became organized action. Crowds targeted the men who would distribute the stamps, pressuring them in public until the job looked dangerous. As the deadline for the tax approached, protest spilled into the streets and stayed there. Demonstrators used intimidation, public shaming, and coordinated pressure to make enforcement collapse before it fully began. The point was simple and hard. The law could not work if the town refused to cooperate. Boston learned something powerful in 1765. Popular protest aimed at the machinery of government could block imperial policy in real time. In 1766, the Stamp Act disappeared and Boston celebrated like the fight had ended. But Parliament refused to call it a retreat. It passed the Declaratory Act, stating it still held full power to make laws for the colonies. That single claim changed the meaning of the repeal. Many colonists had asked for relief. Now they faced a warning. London backed down on one tax, but not on authority. Then came 1767, and a new plan to raise money without a stamp. Parliament approved the Townshend duties, import taxes placed on everyday goods like glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Officials insisted these were different because they were collected at the ports. In Boston, that difference sounded fake. Merchants feared tighter control. Ordinary families saw higher prices. The boycott machinery started up again, faster and broader than before. To make the duties work, customs enforcement tightened into something people met every day. New commissioners and more aggressive inspections targeted smuggling and demanded paperwork for cargo. Each seizure, each search, and each accusation felt personal, and it landed in a crowded harbour where business depended on speed and trust. Boston turned into a test site for enforcement. Protests stopped being only speeches and resolutions. It became a constant clash over who got to police trade. In 1768, Boston reached a breaking point. Customs officials said they could not do their job while crowds pressed in and merchants refused cooperation. They asked London for help. The answer arrived by ship. British troops sent not to fight a foreign enemy, but to control British subjects. Red-coated soldiers marched into a town that already believed its rights were under attack. The occupation changed everything. Political resistance stopped feeling like petitions and boycotts and started feeling like a confrontation. Soldiers took up posts, drilled in public, and moved through streets where many people did not want them. The government wanted order. The town saw intimidation. Every routine moment became a test. A complaint at a shop, a shove near the docks, a shouted insult, and the line tightened. Boston's leaders tried to keep the resistance focused, but the presence of armed men made restraint harder. Troops competed with locals for work and housing, and resentment grew fast. Authorities relied on the soldiers more, not less, and that deepened the sense that Boston was being ruled by force. The standoff settled into daily life. It also made one outcome more likely. A small spark could set off something irreversible. By early 1770, Boston's standoff turned raw. Soldiers lived among people who resented them, and small clashes kept piling up until one night in March when a confrontation spiraled out of control. A crowd pressed in, confusion surged, shots went off, colonists fell in the street, and the event took a name that made it sound like a planned slaughter, the Boston Massacre. It changed the argument overnight. What followed was not just grief, but a fight over meaning. Patriots treated the deaths as proof that an occupying army brought tyranny, and they pushed that message hard, in print and in public memory. British officials and loyalists insisted the soldiers faced a threatening mob and fired in panic. Each side built a simple story for ordinary people to repeat. The gap between Boston and Britain widened because trust no longer existed. Then Parliament tried to lower the temperature without surrendering the principle at stake. Most of the Townshend duties were repealed, a clear attempt to undercut boycotts and restore trade. But one duty stayed on purpose, the tax on tea. It was small, yet it carried a message that Parliament still claimed the right to tax the colonies. So Boston received both an easing and a warning, and neither side truly backed down. By 1772, the conflict spread beyond Boston's streets and into the logic of enforcement itself. Off Rhode Island, a British customs ship, the Gaspee, chased smugglers, ran aground, and became a target. Local men boarded it, overpowered the crew, and burned the vessel. Britain treated it as an attack on royal authority. The colonies saw something else, officials using force, and locals answering back with force. London's response raised the stakes. Investigators prepared to send suspects to Britain for trial, far from local juries and familiar courts. That threat hit a nerve. If people could be taken across the ocean for resisting enforcement, then no colony's rights felt secure. Leaders understood the danger of isolation. A single town could be punished and forgotten. What they needed was speed, coordination, and a way to make every outrage everybody's business. So the committees of correspondence expanded into a working network. In Massachusetts, Samuel Adams helped push Boston to formalize committees that gathered news, wrote reports, and sent them outward. Other towns and colonies copied the idea. Riders carried letters. Printers amplified them. Meetings reacted to them. It was not dramatic like a riot, but it changed the balance. Boston's anger no longer stayed in Boston. It travelled, multiplied, and came back stronger. By 1773, the fight over taxes had not ended. It shifted shape. In London, Parliament passed the Tea Act, a law aimed at rescuing the East India Company, a giant trading business that had stumbled into financial trouble. The plan sounded simple. The company would ship tea straight to the colonies and sell it more cheaply. On paper, it looked like a bargain. In practice, it set a trap. The Tea Act still kept the tea duty in place. That mattered more than the price, because the point was never only money. The point was power. If colonists bought this tea, even discounted, they accepted Parliament's claim that it could tax them without their consent. And the law did something else too. It cut out many colonial middlemen, threatening merchants who had made their living moving tea through established channels. So the crisis returned with a twist. The East India Company prepared shipments, counting on low prices to break resistance and make the tea tax seem harmless. But the bargain made the principle sharper, not softer. Cheap tea became a test of obedience. It forced people to choose between saving money and surrendering a political argument they had fought for years. And once the ship sailed, there was no quiet way out. By late 1773, the argument over tea stopped being theoretical. The East India Company's ships reached Boston carrying the cargo everyone feared, tea tied to Parliament's authority. Word moved fast. Crowds gathered in mass meetings and treated the arrival like an emergency, not a trade delivery. They demanded one clear outcome. The tea had to leave Boston exactly as it arrived, unopened and unsold. The pressure did not come from a few loud activists. It came from thousands, organised and persistent, watching the harbour and the officials who controlled it. The tea importers found themselves trapped between public anger and imperial law. Then the standoff centred on one man, Governor Thomas Hutchinson. He did not just disagree with the meetings, he used his power to block the only peaceful exit. Hutchinson refused to grant clearance for the ships to sail away with the tea still on board, and time mattered. Regulations gave a hard deadline. After a set number of days in port, the cargo had to be landed and the duties paid. That clock turned the protest into a countdown. Boston faced a narrowing set of choices, and none of them stayed harmless for long. On the night of December 16, 1773, the waiting ended. The deadline to deal with the tea approached. The governor still refused to let the ships leave, and Boston's options collapsed into one. After the last public meeting broke apart, a group moved with purpose toward the wharf. They disguised themselves as Mohawks, not to fool anyone completely, but to signal unity and to hide individual identities. Then they climbed aboard the tea ships. 3 vessels sat in the harbour, loaded with the East India Company's tea. The men split into teams and went straight to work. They broke open chest after chest and hauled the tea up, then dumped it over the side into the water. They did not take the tea away, and they did not sell it. They destroyed it. That choice mattered. A protest could be argued with. A ruined cargo became a bill, a crime, and a direct challenge. By the time they finished, the damage was impossible to deny and impossible to reverse. The tea floated and sank through the harbour, and with it went any hope of an easy compromise. This had not been a riot that spun out of control. It had been a planned act with a clear target. The message was simple. The tea and the principle behind it would not be accepted. After that night, Britain faced a decision too, and it did not forgive. In 1774, Britain answered the harbour protest with punishment, not compromise. Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, and in America they quickly became known as the Intolerable Acts. The most immediate blow landed on Boston's livelihood. The port closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. Ships stopped coming. Work dried up. It was meant to isolate the town and force submission. It did the opposite. Other measures tightened the pressure. Massachusetts's self-government shrank as royal authority expanded. Town meetings faced new limits. Trials could be moved away from local juries. To many colonists, this was no longer just about tea or taxes. It was about power and control. And because the punishment targeted one colony as a warning to all, other colonies watched and felt exposed. Resistance started to spread. Aid began to arrive from outside Massachusetts. Food and support sent as a statement that Boston was not alone. Committees and assemblies treated the crisis as a shared problem, not a local quarrel. Then colonies sent delegates to meet in Philadelphia at the First Continental Congress. For the first time, they coordinated across regions, debating how to answer British force with unified action. The conflict widened into something continental. By the time the fighting finally came, the tea had already done its work. The Boston Tea Party stopped being just one night of destruction and turned into a shorthand for a bigger claim. Ordinary people could challenge political power when they believed the rules were rigged. In 1765, Boston had been a small port arguing over new taxes. That argument never really ended. It only expanded. In the years that followed, the Tea Party got retold and reused, sometimes as a warning, sometimes as an instruction. It got treated as proof that protest could be patriotic, even when it broke the law. But it also raised a harder question that never went away. Who decided when resistance crossed the line? The same act looked like principled defiance to some and dangerous disorder to others. In modern America, the Boston Tea Party still sat at the centre of arguments about taxes, representation, and trust in government. People invoked it to demand lower taxes, to attack distant decision-makers, or to defend direct action when normal politics felt blocked. The country grew from one pressured harbour town into a massive nation, but the core fight stayed familiar. Power demanded obedience, dissent demanded legitimacy.